Hey guys, Mr. Gibson here. We're going to talk about price elasticity of supply. Let's go through some objectives here and some essential knowledge. The learning objectives are much the same from price elasticity of demand. We're going to define the elasticity, we're going to calculate it. Um, this whole thing about total revenue, that that only really talk we only really talk about that in price elasticity of demand. Okay, we look at these essential knowledge points to hit here, talking about the calculation itself, which is very similar to the price elasticity of demand calculation. uh, the range of values with elasticity, again, very similar to the price elasticity demand. We'll have values that represent elastic supply, unit elastic supply, and also uh, inelastic supply. And then finally, we'll talk about what influences the elasticity of supply. Why would a supply be inelastic versus why would it be elastic? So on and so forth. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about some slides I have for you guys. One is this first slide, which describes the actual calculation of price elasticity of supply. It's the percent change in quantity supplied over the percent change in price. Very similar to demand. Notice it doesn't say the change in supply. It's the quantity supply, so we're moving along that supply curve. Um, Supply curve isn't changing. Um, we're also talking about, we're also talking about quantity supplied, so it's always increasing uh, as the price itself increases. So we don't have to worry about doing an absolute value or anything like that. So just pretty straightforward calculation that you guys have actually done already, except now we're applying it to quantity supplied. Okay. So I also made this example here. Once it loads, okay. Uh, we've got price. We have some prices here, some quantity supplied. All right. Um, I've used that to make a graph. As you guys can tell, it's an upward sloping graph. Um, just like price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply a uh, is not represented by the slope. It's a different calculation than slope. Okay, it's a percent change calculation. So just keep that in mind. No different than the demand. Okay, so let's use some of these numbers to go ahead and calculate price elasticity of supply. Okay, so if I look at this one, how about we use um, how about let's think here. I might use let's do this. Uh, from 5,000 to 7,000 and from 3 to 4. Okay. Hopefully, I haven't chosen one that's too difficult to do. Okay. So, go to this right here, talking about percent changes once again. Okay. So, for price elasticity demand, I want to find, or price elasticity of supply, pardon me, I want to find the percent change. That's a percent sign. That delta means change, percent change in quantity supplied. Okay. Final minus initial times 100%. And the case I wanted to use here, let's use 7,000 as our final and 5,000 as our initial. Okay. All over 5,000. That's 2,000 over 5,000, which amounts to 2/5. Oops, excuse me. Got ahead of myself. 2/5. And times that by 100%, and that will give me 40%. Okay. just for the sake of room. Okay. All right. So to keep it consistent, I used this is initial and this is final. The top is final. So I want to go ahead and do the same thing here where I use 4 minus 3 over 3 for my percent change in price. Percent delta means change in price. I've got, what was that? It was 4 minus 3, sorry. So 4 minus 3 over 3. That's 1/3. I times that by 100%. And that gives me 33%. Okay. All right. Same thing as last time where got our elasticity, which is percent change quantity supplied over percent change in price. I could use my percentages, but I actually prefer to use fractions. You could do 40% over 33%, or just cancel the percentages and use zero point 0.4 over 0.33, or use those fractions instead. Okay. So keep it, change it, flip it, keep the 2/5, change the sign to times, flip the 1/3 to 3 ones. That gives me 6/5. Okay. 5 over 5 is 100%, leaves over 1 over 5, which is, can make it a mixed fraction of 1 over 1/5, which again is 1.20. Okay. 1/5 is 20% or 0.20. Okay. So that's our price elasticity of supply. Okay. So any way that you like to calculate that, there's other ways to calculate percent changes. This is what I like to do, but ultimately you should get to the same number. If you were to put 40% over 30% in your calculator, you should put 0.12 as well. Okay. So anyway, um, we've done our calculation. So let's see what the computer did with our calculation as well. All right. Sure enough, we were right. 0.120. Okay. As you guys notice, we have a range of values here. It changes along the supply curve, like I told you guys. It's not a slope calculation, it's a percent change calculation. Um, there's no interesting part to this. Supply just captures a firm's cost. Costs are increasing. The marginal cost would actually increase as well. So that's what this elasticity captures. Okay. So what we want to talk about is really just the conceptual side of what this elasticity means. Okay. So as you guys notice, we have values that are below 1 up here. So we start up at a price of 5 way up here. Um, and we move down into elasticities that are greater. Okay. That are greater than 1 or bigger as we get closer and closer to our last number right there. Okay, and that was at 2. So let's keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. Okay. So again, it's a lot like um, price elasticity demand. Okay. If the elasticity is greater than 1, it's elastic. If it's between 0 and 1, it's inelastic. If it equals 1, it's unit elastic. If it's equal to infinity, it's this says totally elastic. Another way to say it is perfectly elastic. And if it equals 0, it's totally or perfectly inelastic. Okay. Just like price elasticity of demand. Okay. Um, Much like price elasticity of demand, the graphs are similar. If you have a horizontal supply curve, it's perfectly elastic. If you have a supply curve that is pretty flat but upward sloping, it's relatively elastic. It's not perfectly elastic. There is some sort of um, there's not a perfect reaction to prices, but there's a significant um, reaction to prices. I wouldn't worry too much about unitary elastic or unit elastic graph there. Relatively inelastic supply, pretty steep curve. And then, of course, perfectly or completely or totally inelastic, you have a vertical supply curve showing that no matter what the price is, they're going to produce the exact same amount. Okay. So let's talk about this a little bit conceptually. What would make a firm more or less inelastic in their supply? And this is a story of how quickly they can convert their inputs into from one product to another. Okay, if they can't change their inputs to produce another product quickly or cheaply, then their elasticity is going to be fairly inelastic. Okay, you could think about this as like some sort of, I guess in the news right now, uh, companies that produce oil, okay, companies that refine oil. So it's really hard to change their inputs. The oil that they get, the oil that they refine, the machinery that's used to produce oil. So they're probably going to try to produce about the same amount of oil, um, no matter the price. They're going to be relatively inelastic with the production of oil. Examples of folks that might be fairly elastic supply could be farmers. Folks I know that are farmers, they tend to be able to grow different crops different years, right? So if you anticipate the price of soybeans being higher one year than corn, you'll tend to plant soybeans instead of corn, or wheat instead of corn, or if you're livestock farm, you could change what type of livestock you're using based on the price. So you might have relatively elastic demand. You could think of this as small businesses that are like retail businesses. Um, if you're a clothing store, you can kind of change the style of clothing that you put in that clothing store that you're going to sell. So that'd be relatively elastic. So it's how quickly, how cheaply you could change your inputs um, to produce something else, or use your inputs to try to change it into something else. Okay. Um, if it's very difficult to do and very expensive, then you have fairly inelastic supply. If it's very cheap to do and very easy to do, you have relatively elastic supply. Okay, so that's all I really need to say about that. Kind of recap some of our essential knowledges and uh, some of our learning objectives. Just make sure we've hit everything. So learning objective, we defined the elasticity, we calculated it, we talked about how it relates to cost or total revenue. Like I said, it doesn't uh, price elasticity demand doesn't have much to say about that. That's a more of a price elasticity of excuse me, flip that. Price elasticity supply doesn't have much to say about that. Price elasticity demand is what goes into this total revenue relation here. Central knowledge. We talked about where the calculation comes from, what the formula is. We talked about the ranges. Elasticity is greater than 1. It's elastic, equal to 1, a unit elastic. And if it's less than 1, we call it inelastic. Okay. And then finally, we talked about what causes price elasticity to be elastic versus inelastic. Elastic means that you can change what you're producing very quickly and cheaply and efficiently based on the inputs that you have. Whereas if you have inelastic supply, it's very difficult or expensive or maybe even impossible to change your inputs so you can produce something else. Okay. So thanks for your attention. And